Nerd files about friction. Can you see this ski? It's really hard to see, but I shot some close-up video to illustrate it better. There's a little different structure on the edges than in the middle. This is one of these fancy G5 Plus grinds that we make that have a smoother grind along the edge than in the middle. And this sort of introduces a concept or begs the question of friction, how it works, what we're actually trying to manage here. This is a little bit complex, and I actually came up with a pretty good explanation that I used to have on the website, but I took it down because it seemed a little too esoteric. So friction, when we talk about friction, there's two basic types of friction, two resistive forces to our glide under the ski that we're mostly concerned with. One is mechanical friction, or what we would consider dry friction, but it's really the interaction of mechanical bits, the abrasion, if you will, of the ski on the snow surface. This mechanical friction is responsive both to pressure and to surface area, and this is everyone kind of understands this. If you have two objects and you push harder between them, it gets, you experience more friction. On the other hand, you increase surface area, like with a car tire or a mountain bike tire. Drop the pressure, increase the contact patch, you've got better grip. That's, increase in surface area. So both increasing pressure and surface area will increase this mechanical friction. And then you've had, on the other hand, adhesion, which is what we call wet friction. It's you introduce water or a fluid film between the ski base and the snow, and you always get an increase in friction based on the adhesive and cohesive properties of the water. Water tends to stick well to itself. It's got surface tension and it holds together, and it sticks well to the ski base and the snow. The adhesion of the water is interrupted by roughness, or again, as we reduce surface area, we reduce the amount of adhesion that is in there, but also as we induce turbulence and break up the surface tension, we can reduce that adhesive wet friction. So when we get down to it, as we make a rougher grind, we are increasing mechanical friction, but as we make a smoother grind to decrease mechanical friction, we're increasing the amount of adhesion or sucky feeling wet friction that we're going to get between the ski and the snow, and these two are constantly kind of counteracting each other. It's also really important to consider that there are frictional regimes. There are whole sort of types of concerns that we have, and basically that boils down to static friction or really low speed friction, that feeling of resistance to getting the ski moving, or the tendency for the ski to want to sort of hitch in and stop. You know this in really cold conditions when you're trying to climb a hill and the skis just want to come to a stop. That's static friction. On the other hand, we have kinetic friction. Kinetic friction is the friction between two moving surfaces. And as soon as we introduce a state of flow in between, so we're talking about water, liquid water or moisture, or even just the flow of unconsolidated or unpacked snow crystals or even plastic deformation, then we get into viscous friction, flow states under the ski. And so these all get balanced pretty interestingly. So how do we deal with this in terms of the ski itself? Well, we have a couple of tools here, and on the one hand, we have the pressure distribution of the ski. Pressure and contact areas, surface contact, are really important. And when we're looking at the skis and selecting the skis, we are trying to pick camber profiles to have either a short contact area or an elongated contact area. There's an inverse relationship between contact area and pressure. Skis under a known load, that's the skier load, and as you increase the surface area, you decrease the pressure around that area. Conventional wisdom is that you want to spread the surface area out as long as possible. Many people still to this day tell me, oh, you want long skis so that you have more surface area because they'll be faster that way. That's actually really not true. Pretty much every actual study that's been done seems to indicate that decreased surface area relates to increased speed or decreased friction. And that makes a ton of sense when you think about mechanical friction and adhesion cohesion. But there's that pressure situation as well, that sensation that when you push harder, you get more friction. So this comes down to a sort of a difference in snow types and everything else. Even in cold conditions, most research suggests that less surface area makes faster skis. However, a lot of our personal experience indicates that more surface area makes faster skis because we're reducing the pressure. I think it has to do with snow types, and this really varies geographically. When you have really sharp snow, I think that increasing the pressure makes it more difficult to break that mechanical friction, whereas when you have snow that's duller and more round, you tend to not have the penalty associated with pressure and have much more penalty associated with surface area. So there's an interesting recent study that Todd Eastman referred me to from a bunch of folks in Sweden. Swedes always do the best research. Looking at the interplay of camber or contact area with pressure versus grind with pressure. And what they found was that the surface area has to do not just with the contact area under the ski based on the camber profile, but with the interaction between the snowpack and the structure. So when you have a rougher grind, you limit the surface area and you increase the pressure. And what they found measuring the response under skis is that the grind has a much more profound effect on surface area and pressure than the camber of the ski. This is a little bit of a surprise to me, but it seems to indicate that grinding is more important than camber. That can be true, but we also know in absolute terms that camber is super important. I just don't think the camber is that important when you get down to the pressure. I think the camber has a lot more to do with the most intriguing part of frictional systems under the ski, and that's when we start talking about friction types, and we're talking about kinetic friction and viscous friction versus static friction. So much of the study of structure and camber has to do with assumptions based on static friction. A lot of grinds, for example, are measured using an RA or a roughness average. It uses a surface profilometer and measures the profile of the ski and calculates a surface roughness in nanometers or something like that. And I think it's basically useless. Sure, it tells you about the roughness and you can make some assumptions about pressure based on that, but these assumptions seem to have almost everything to do with static frictional regimes and very little to do with kinetic friction. When we start talking about kinetic friction, we're talking about stuff that hasn't really been very well measured or described. We're talking about the texture of the grind. We're talking about I think I've shown you some videos of like what the snow sees when we hold a camera down and we go along the ski. You have to imagine the interaction of snow crystals, moisture with the base in motion, and the texture and leading edge shape and trailing edge release, not to mention the contact angles, the ramp up, the build to pressure, and the release angles in the ski become super, super important. I think it's a little more complex than what can be described in simple static friction terms with regard to pressure and surface area. But what we do know is that we can modify structure in different parts of the base according to our concerns having to do with pressure. So this G5 plus grind is an interesting one. What we find is that the G5 is our finest grind. It's really, really super fine crossing structure with a really smooth surface, and it's really nice in slow conditions, super big favorite of this early morning Sun Valley crowd where they have this evaporational cooling overnight, cold mornings, and recrystallization into really, really sharp, fresh ice crystals on the ground makes for extremely slow snow, and having a very smooth grind is super important, particularly when you're moving at lower speeds. However, G5 has almost never been used as a high-level race grind. There are a few exceptions. Terra Garrity Moats used it a bunch in her Nordic Combine races, and it did really well for Elena Sonesson in the 30K at U.S. Nationals in Houghton a few years ago in near freezing conditions, but really sharp lake effect snow. But typically it just doesn't deliver high-end performance based on the demands of kinetic and viscous friction for racers at a higher level. So we built this G5 Plus so that when the ski is flat on the snow, when it's experiencing the highest potential adhesion-cohesion effect based on increased surface area being flat on the snow, we introduce more air into the system and more roughness by creating an underlayer in the structure in the middle of the ski. But when the ski is on edge, we experience increased pressure along the edge based on a massive decrease in surface area contact. And to avoid spiking the static friction and to retain the benefit of that G5 structure in release, especially at low speeds when climbing, we leave that underlayer off the edge of the ski. The grinder is driven by a big computer. It lives in that gray box over there. And essentially it's like a CNC lathe. This piston right here advances the diamond in, and we can program that in steps and stages to be able to move in, move back out, move over. We can vary the speed of the traverse. We can do all sorts of different things. We can make sort of fancy grinds based on the numeric control of the grinder. So if we want to do what we did with that G5, it's not a really big deal to vary the structure across the width of the stone. There's also this assumption that often you want to have less structure on the front of the ski than on the tail of the ski because there's going to be less water on the front of the ski. I don't think that's actually why that is. This might be a valid point, but I think it has to do with more sensitivity on the front of the ski based on the fact that you're basically skiing on thinner material and you get a lot of feedback and feel the friction on the front of the ski much more. Reducing the mechanical interface up front seems to have some bearing on the performance of the ski, particularly the snow touch performance or the feel skating uphill. But we almost never really vary the structure on a classic ski because if you want the structure, you want the structure. We used to do a grind that Nat Brown made back in the old days called an R2.3, I think, where it had a band of structure up here and another band and then increased structure in the back. I've done versions where I mapped the pressure zones and then decreased the amount of grind on a compound structure in the underlayer in the high pressure zones in order to make easier release where there's a lot of pressure, but have more roughness and turbulence generated where there's less pressure in order to deal with the adhesion around the pressure zones. So we know we have on a skate ski increased pressure along the edges and increased pressure in the middle, and I've actually done a grind that has like all these different dimensions to it. So lighter structure here, lighter structure out here. They don't end up being that impressive. It just doesn't work all that much. Sure, this G5 Plus seems to have a benefit. I could probably come really close just by leaving it all the way out to the edge, but this looks cooler. I think part of the issue here is that there's always a trade-off. Just as we have seen that by laying off the roughness in the pressure zone, I've also seen people add hand structure to the pressure zone. So they're adding structure to the pressure zone and have good results. It could go both ways. You want less and you want more. It's just like in cold conditions, you want short contact zones because you're going to have more mechanical friction with more surface area, but you also want long contact zones because you're going to have less pressure as you distribute over a wider area. There's so much interplay and trade-off, and it varies so much from one set of conditions to another that it's really hard to say anything definitive. We can vary the structure along the length of the ski in a couple of ways. The old school R2.3 way was to lift and drop the structure. So we would put the ski in, and then when we got to where we wanted to stop, we would lift the stone up and pull the ski off, and then we'd hold the ski in the middle and drop the thing on. I should be illustrating this with a real grind, but we're in the middle of a final structure batch. The newer way to vary structure along the length of the ski is to use the vario table, what they call. We can tell it when you're 800 millimeters in, we want to increase the downforce or the drive speed. We can vary the drive speed and the downforce along the length of the ski with each pass, and therefore we can change the shape and texture of the structure using those variables. I will admit readily that I made this grind after I saw that base. Looks kind of cool, doesn't it? Anyway, there you go.